In the early days of the 20th century, powered flight began to take shape, from the early experiments by the Wright Brothers to the adoption of military aircraft, from rickety pusher biplanes to the speedy scouts of the Great War. In a matter of a decade or so, aircraft went from a curiosity to a crucial part of any military operation. This was, however, all on land. When it comes to the sea, it took a bit longer for military aviation to come into its own. This was understandable. It was difficult enough to land an early aircraft on solid ground. Landing it on a moving ship was another realm of difficulty altogether. That will be the topic of this video. Before we get to that point, though, it is important to note that naval aviation experiments did happen. The most notable, of course, being those of Eugene Ely in the United States, or Eugene Elly, or Eugene Ely. I've seen his name pronounced in various different ways. In any case, he proved that you could take off from a ship by launching from a platform built on the bow of USS Birmingham. That was on November 14th, 1910. He would then do the reverse a couple months later in landing on another cruiser with a platform built on top of it. In this case, USS Pennsylvania, on January 18th, 1911. The cruiser had a platform fitted to her stern, and Ely landed aboard it. For as pioneering as these were, however, they were on stationary ships. Moving ships would have to wait a bit. That would end up coming towards the end of the Great War in 1917, specifically with the Royal Navy and HMS Furious. I have a much longer video on her career that I'll link in the description. However, for some context before we move on, HMS Furious began as the wackiest of Jackie Fisher's large light cruisers. A ship with the armor and speed of a light cruiser, but the size of a battle cruiser. In the case of Courageous and Glorious, they also carried the weaponry of a battle cruiser in the form of 4 15-inch guns. Furious, meanwhile, was designed to carry 2 massive and slow-firing 18-inch guns, in 2 single turrets on either end of the ship. This was not the best idea Fisher ever had. Furious ended up completing with only her stern turret and a flying-off platform on her bow. That flying-off platform is the important part for this video. While Furious was by no means a proper aircraft carrier, that platform allowed her to launch aircraft into combat and carry spares, something that only seaplane carriers could really do up to that point. What the platform was not intended for was landing aircraft, until a British equivalent to Eugene Ely stepped forward. That man was Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning. He was Furious's first aviation officer and had already been involved with early experiments in naval aviation, specifically in the theory of aircraft carrier operations. For the purposes of this video, the commander had one thing he really wanted to do. Dunning, supported by his commanding officer, decided to try landing on HMS Furious. He wanted to see if landing on the ship was possible, and from there, how it could be used in actual operations. This was still theory to this point, but if Dunning could pull it off, well, it would move from theory into practice. Furious would be able to land planes and operate them repeatedly, instead of her designed role of launching aircraft and having them land ashore or be picked up by other ships. This would be proper naval aviation, not one-and-done launches. A revolution if there ever was one. That said, the problem was fairly obvious. The flying-off deck on Furious was comparatively tiny. Again, it wasn't really designed to land anything. There was also the glaring issue of Furious's superstructure. Her bridge and funnel were in the way of any landing approach. That meant a pilot would have to both swing around the superstructure and fight both wind and funnel exhaust. And, even if you got past those issues, Furious had no dedicated landing equipment like arrestor wires, or even a crash barrier for that matter. Nonetheless, Edwin Dunning was going to make the attempt. So, with this in mind, Dunning and his fellow officers put together a strategy. They would take a Sopwith Pup, a light and generally forgiving plane, and attempt a landing on Furious. Dunning would do the deed himself on August 2nd, 1917. He took advantage of Furious steaming along at about 26 knots into a 21-knot headwind. The combination of these factors created a wind over her deck of about 47 knots. A Sopwith Pup's landing speed, on average, was about 40 miles per hour, or 35 knots. This was important in context, because as he came in on a landing approach from Furious's port side, Dunning's plane functionally hovered over the middle of Furious's deck, the Pup's landing speed against the headwind holding it in place. By repeatedly flicking his engine on and off, Dunning landed gently on the hangar roof at the widest point of Furious's deck. Men promptly swarmed his little plane to hold it in place as he completed the first landing on Furious, the world's first aircraft carrier landing. Of course, not the first landing on a ship in general, as we saw earlier. Unfortunately, Dunning would attempt to replicate his feat on August 7th, 1917, and he would perish in the process. His plane would lose power at the worst moment, and the wind would lift it off the side of the ship. Dunning was knocked out on impact with the water and drowned in his seat, or a tire burst which caused the plane to swerve over the side, or some combination of the two. Sources will differ on this, but the result remains the same. Dunning and his pup fell away from Furious, and the pioneering pilot drowned in his plane. A sad loss for naval aviation, by all accounts. Even so, Dunning's legacy was established. He proved that it was possible to land on a moving ship, and Furious, further modified, would become one of the first proper aircraft carriers. A brave man and his little biplane paved the way towards the supercarriers of the modern day. Not a bad legacy at all. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.